The air in the abandoned packing facility was thick, a viscous mix of humidity, stale concrete dust, and the metallic tang of uncleaned weapons oil. It clung to the skin like cheap plastic wrap. Every breath was a conscious effort, dragging the grit across the back of the throat. It was the kind of industrial ruin where light didn't penetrate. It just smeared, casting long, fractured shadows that danced with the occasional distant traffic vibration. Sergeant Bro. Santos stood perfectly still just inside the doorway. Or, rather, Mrs. Smith, as she had introduced herself to the local precinct 3 hours ago, a worried, frantic civilian mother, wearing a hastily thrown-on linen blouse and jeans that were just slightly too clean for the environment, suggesting a hurried departure from normalcy. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, insignificant, invisible. Opposite her, seated behind a folding table littered with spent shells, smoldering cigarettes and half-eaten cans of beans, was the officer. We'll call him Colonel Torres, though the only rank he truly held was self-appointed terror. He was built like a repurposed bulldozer, thick neck, hands the size of dinner plates, and eyes that were already bored with the pathetic display of fear he expected to see from the woman before him. 4 men stood loosely flanking him, all young, all armed with AKMs, and all operating on the lethal complacency that comes from holding absolute power over the defenseless. They hadn't bothered to search her thoroughly. A nervous mother wouldn't hide anything important. She was just the delivery mechanism for the ransom. Torres leaned back, the cheap plastic chair groaning in protest under his weight. He exhaled a plume of gray smoke that smelled like burned sugar. His left hand, resting casually near his holster, began to tap a slow, rhythmic pattern on the table. Tick-tick, tick-tick. Santos analyzed the room, not with her eyes but with a specific, highly trained neural pathway that processed threat assessment. Torres. Center mass. Primary threat. Arrogant, predictable movements. Left-hand movement suggests low-level anxiety masking aggression. Distance, 12 feet. Too far for immediate close-quarters termination, but perfect for observation. Weakness, reliance on gravity and mass, slow to pivot. Guard 1, far left. Leaning against the wall, checking his phone screen frequently. Distracted. Weapon sling too loose. Threat rating, low priority. Guard 2, near Torres, right. Posture rigid, eyes scanning the exits. Professional training? No. Just paranoia. Sweating profusely, overcompensating. Threat rating, medium, easily manipulated. Guard 3 and 4, rear, near the single exit. Conversing softly, ignoring the main interaction. Complacency level, critical. Their positioning blocks the primary escape route, making them primary targets for clearance. The clock inside her head wasn't measuring seconds. It was measuring vectors, trajectories, and potential kinetic energy expenditure. She hadn't moved since she entered, but she had already killed every man in the room 3 times in her mind, choosing the most efficient sequence. "The money, Mrs. Smith," Torres finally said, his voice grating, like stones rolling in a rusty barrel. He used the Mrs. Smith with a sneer, drawing out the syllables as if mocking the banality of her suburban existence. Santos gripped the worn leather messenger bag in her hands. It was heavy, weighted with lead blocks disguised beneath the top layer of marked bills, just enough real cash to satisfy the initial glance. She walked forward exactly 6 measured paces and set the bag down gently, not dropping it, but placing it with the quiet reverence of a priest setting down a sacred text. The movement was economical, 0 hesitation. She stopped just outside the critical reactionary distance, the zone where a sudden move would trigger an instinctive defensive response from the guards. "It's all there," she stated. Her voice was steady, level, slightly low. It lacked the frantic pitch he was waiting for. It lacked the tears. This registered subtly in Torres's peripheral awareness, a slight anomaly, but he dismissed it instantly. Fear manifests in a million predictable ways. This woman was just in shock. Torres didn't touch the bag. He pushed it with his boot, sliding it toward Guard 2. "Count it!" Guard 2, relieved to have a task, knelt quickly, ripping the bag open. He didn't bother to check the blocks beneath the surface. He was looking for stacks, for bulk. Torres's eyes, heavy with predatory expectation, lifted back to Santos. He smiled, a wet, unpleasant contraction of muscle that didn't reach his eyes. "Your daughter," he mused, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Eliza. Pretty name. Very spirited, I hear. Kicked one of my men when we picked her up near the market." He paused, letting the implication hang in the stale air. Discipline is hard to instill these days, isn't it, Mrs. Smith? Especially for single mothers. Santos felt the familiar cold pressure building in her chest. It wasn't anger. Anger was wasteful, exothermic, and messy. This was the deep-seated crystalline resolve that defined the difference between a protective instinct and a lethal function. The threat to her child was the catalyst that changed her operating state from passive concealment to active engagement. The moment he used Eliza's name to invoke fear, the game shifted from negotiation to execution. "She's a good girl," Santos replied, her gaze locked directly on his. Torres chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Good girls belong in their place. And right now, her place is secure, safe." He leaned further, his massive torso blocking the low-wattage light behind him. "We need a little more, Mrs. Smith. The market rate for inconvenience has gone up this quarter. We only counted half the required sum." Guard 2, who hadn't actually counted anything beyond the first stack, nodded vigorously in agreement. "We want the rest, or, well, the discipline might get a little more strenuous." Torres gestured vaguely toward the back of the facility where she knew instinctively her daughter was being held. This was the tripwire. This was the moment he asked for more, confirming his intent to extract everything possible, financial and psychological, before disposing of the asset. He had failed to consider the hidden cost of the exchange. Santos took a small, almost imperceptible step back, adjusting the microscopic strain in the tendons of her left foot. The movement was so small it was invisible to the untrained eye. To Torres it looked like retreating fear. "I told you everything I have is in that bag," Santos said. The lie was smooth, frictionless. "Then you must be very poor, Mrs. Smith," Torres mocked. He reached down slowly, deliberately, pulling a heavy-caliber sidearm from his hip holster. He rested the muzzle on the table, pointing vaguely toward her center mass. The gesture was meant to crush the last vestiges of her resistance. "Perhaps you can earn the rest back. We have ways you can contribute to our cause." The room went silent, save for the hum of an old fluorescent tube struggling to stay alive overhead. Guard 1 stopped looking at his phone. Guard 2 stood up, smirk plastered on his face. They were waiting for the breakdown, the tears, the plea. Santos didn't blink. Her eyes remained steady, focused not on the muzzle, but on the micro-movements of Torres's trigger finger. It was too relaxed. He still saw her as inert. "You don't understand, Colonel," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, calm as the bottom of a deep well. "I came here with a very specific purpose." Torres scoffed, irritated by her lack of proper terror response. "And what purpose is that, broken mother?" Santos paused. The air seemed to condense around her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't display the sudden burst of adrenaline expected from a desperate civilian. Instead, she took another deep breath, cataloging the smell of Torres's cheap cologne, a masking scent, poorly applied, and the exact weight distribution of her tactical vest, molded seamlessly beneath the loose-fitting civilian blouse. She knew the weight of every tool, every seam. Then she spoke, and the timbre of her voice changed. It wasn't the voice of Mrs. Smith, the grieving parent. It was the voice of Sergeant Santos, call sign Technique, Operations Directorate, a ghost in the machine of asymmetrical warfare. "My purpose," she articulated, the words clipped and precise, devoid of inflection, "is recovery, threat mitigation, and kinetic neutralization of all opposing forces." Torres's smile froze. He didn't understand the words, not intellectually, but the sound. The cold, flat authority sent a shiver up his spine. It was the sound of a verdict, not a negotiation. "What in God's name are you talking about?" he demanded, leaning back, slightly unnerved. Santos didn't answer. Her right hand moved. It didn't reach for a weapon. It moved to the small, barely visible zipper pull on the inside lining of the messenger bag she had placed on the floor. Torres's eyes widened, recognizing the non-compliance too late. He started to bring his pistol up. Analysis. Threat vector alpha initiated. Time to countermeasure, 0.4 seconds. The transformation was absolute and instant. The maternal slump vanished. Her spine snapped straight. Her feet settled into a low combat stance learned in the arid wastes of the northern frontier. Every muscle fired in concert. She did not draw a firearm. Instead, her index finger slipped into the bag and hooked a 3-inch ceramic shard, a tool designed for specific silent work. Her left hand, simultaneously, moved in a blur. It didn't attack Torres. It slapped the heavy lead-weighted bag upward, using the momentum to flip the table. The folding table shot into the air like a poorly aimed shield, clattering against Torres's chest. The impact wasn't enough to hurt him, but it startled him, interrupting his aiming arc, forcing his massive body to twist instinctively to protect himself. His pistol flew wide, clattering onto the concrete. Time elapsed. 0.7 seconds. The room erupted. Guard 1, momentarily stunned, fumbled for his weapon. Santos did not engage Torres immediately. She had optimized for threat clearance. The messenger bag, still airborne from the flip, provided a microscopic distraction, drawing the eyes of guards 3 and 4 near the exit. Target 1, guard 1, the distracted. Santos lunged left, crossing the 12-foot gap to the wall in 2 impossibly smooth strides. Guard 1 was still struggling to pull his AKM into position. The ceramic shard flashed. It was not a slash. It was a precise downward puncture beneath the clavicle, severing the brachial plexus nerve cluster. The guard gasped, his arm instantly useless, dropping the rifle. Before his body could register the pain, Santos brought her elbow back in a tight kinetic arc, shattering his nose and driving the bone fragments upward. The guard collapsed silently, his operational life ending before his body hit the floor. He hadn't even fired a single round. Time elapsed. 1.5 seconds. Target 2, guard 2, the paranoiac, counter. Guard 2, having seen the lightning-fast movement, raised his rifle, yelling in panic. Santos was already moving, using the collapsed guard 1's body as a momentary screen. She didn't try to close the distance. Instead, she performed a low-velocity, controlled slide, retrieving Torres's dropped pistol with her left hand as she moved. She didn't look at the weapon. Her training allowed for immediate muscle memory acquisition. Guard 2 fired a single, poorly aimed burst, 3 rounds stitching the air where Santos had been half a second prior. Before he could correct his aim, Santos was up, leveraging the momentum from the slide. She didn't shoot him in the chest. That was messy and unreliable. She executed a perfect double tap, high velocity, 1 round into the ocular orbit, the second into the temple. The report was deafening in the confined space. Guard 2 dropped like a puppet whose strings had been cut mid-dance, his rifle clattering into a puddle of spilled beans. Time elapsed. 2.8 seconds. 2 neutralized. 0 incoming threat fire sustained. The silence that followed the gunfire was thicker than the humidity. It wasn't a true silence. It was the total cessation of organized resistance. Colonel Torres was scrambling behind the flipped table, his face a sudden mask of absolute, paralyzing fear. He realized, with a sinking, gut-wrenching certainty, that the terrified mother had vanished, replaced by something entirely mechanical and profoundly efficient. Guards 3 and 4, the exit blockers, reacted simultaneously, swinging their rifles around. But they were reacting to the sound, not the source. They didn't have line of sight. Santos didn't wait. She used Torres's heavy pistol, a caliber she despised for its poor balance but appreciated for its stopping power, and fired 2 rounds over the top of the flipped table, not at the guards, but deliberately into the single suspended steel support girder that held the roof above their heads. The echoing clang of the rounds impacting the thick steel was calculated to disorient, creating an auditory distraction. Target 3 and 4, the exit blockers. While guards 3 and 4 paused, blinking against the sudden deafening noise and the microscopic spray of steel dust, Santos was already in motion. She dropped the pistol. It was empty, having served its purpose, and pulled the primary tool from beneath her blouse, a specialized coiled carbon fiber cable, weighted and tipped with brass ferrules. She executed a crossroom dash that was not running, but a controlled, low-profile tactical sprint, angled toward the guard's blind spot. Guard 3 finally spotted her, swinging his rifle around. Too slow. The cable snapped out with the sound of a cracking whip. It did not hit his neck. It wrapped tightly around the muzzle of his rifle, pulling the barrel sharply downward. Guard 3, startled, pulled the trigger reflexively. The resulting round slammed harmlessly into the concrete floor, sending a spray of fragments into his shins. Before he could process the error, Santos was past him, the movement of the cable generating a counter-rotation that spun Guard 3 completely around, making him a momentary human shield. Guard 4 fired, missing Santos entirely, the rounds tearing through the sleeve of Guard 3's shirt. Santos released the cable from Guard 3's rifle, letting him stumble. She executed a low, powerful sweep kick, snapping Guard 4's supporting leg just above the ankle. The bone fractured with an audible crack. As Guard 4 screamed and fell forward, Santos used the coiled cable to execute a figure-8 wrap, cinching it around the throat and carotid arteries in a perfect, high-speed choke. The pressure was immense and immediate. The guard went limp instantly, silently, his lungs starved for air, his operational status terminated. Guard 3, still disoriented and recovering from the spin, turned to see his partner already dead. He raised his weapon slowly, despair replacing arrogance. Santos didn't use the cable on him. She retrieved the ceramic shard from where she had embedded it in Guard 1. Guard 3 stared at the sliver of white ceramic in her hand, recognizing it not as a weapon, but as a scalpel. He lowered the rifle, understanding the message. She had the capability for distance and velocity, but she was choosing intimacy, choosing her method. "Where is Eliza?" Santos asked, her voice returning to that low, flat whisper. Guard 3, trembling, pointed a shaky finger toward a heavily bolted steel door in the back wall. Santos nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement. Then, with an almost apologetic lack of fanfare, she closed the distance, utilizing the ceramic shard for a single, devastating puncture to the base of the skull, entering the foramen magnum. Guard 3 collapsed, his consciousness severed immediately from his nervous system. Time elapsed. 5.1 seconds. 4. Neutralized. Total clean sweep. 0 threats remaining except the principal. The room was now silent, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, yet the violence felt contained, precise, surgical. Sergeant Santos stood over the bodies, breathing slowly, deeply, her heart rate already regulating back toward baseline. Her white linen shirt was untouched, save for a microscopic smear of oil from the rifle muzzle she had redirected. She turned slowly, deliberately, toward Colonel Torres, who was still huddled behind the flipped table, whimpering softly. He was trying desperately to reholster his pistol, only to realize he had dropped it minutes ago. Santos didn't have to announce herself. Her posture, the stillness of her body, the cold, analytical deadness in her eyes. It was enough. He saw not a woman, but a consequence. Torres pushed the table away, crawling backward on his hands and knees, dragging his bulk across the dusty floor until his back hit the cold concrete wall. He looked up at her, the fear finally stripping away every layer of his manufactured authority. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice thin, panicked. "You're not just some civilian. You're CIA, military. Who sent you?" Santos walked slowly toward him, closing the final few feet. She stepped over the cash-filled messenger bag without a glance. She stopped directly over him, casting him into her shadow. She reached up slowly and moved the collar of her linen blouse aside. In the hollow of her throat, just beneath the smooth curve of her jaw, was a small, faded tattoo, a stylized, three-pointed dagger, deeply scarred and barely visible. It wasn't the insignia of a known unit. It was the mark of a classification, Technician, Directorate of Special Operations, Tier 1 clearance. It was the quiet, brutal equivalent of wearing a graveyard on your neck. Torres stared at the mark. He had seen similar symbols, whispered about in dark corners. Marks belonging to the people who cleaned up the messes other people only started, the ones who didn't exist on any public payroll. Ghosts. Santos knelt, bringing her face close to his, close enough for him to smell the faint scent of ozone from the recent muzzle flash, close enough for him to see the complete absence of light in her eyes. She whispered, her voice colder than the concrete beneath his knees. "Nobody sent me, Colonel. There are no operational mandates, no command structure, no rules of engagement." She placed the flat, cold edge of the ceramic shard against the soft underside of his jaw, just beneath the earlobe. The pressure was feather-light, yet absolute. "I came here because you threatened my daughter." Torres tried to speak, but the threat of the blade silenced him. His eyes flickered desperately toward the steel door where Eliza was held, then back to Santos. "I was an idiot," he whimpered, the words barely audible. "I didn't know. I thought you were just a mother. And that was your tactical error," Santos confirmed. She pressed the shard just enough to draw a single pearlescent bead of blood. "Because what you encountered here today was not a civilian. It was the consequence of a choice." She retracted the blade slightly, then executed the final, defining action that solidified her identity. Her left hand rose, moving with the precision of a clock mechanism. She did not salute. She didn't use military parlance. Instead, her fingers curled around the small leather-bound wallet she pulled from the hidden pocket inside her jeans. She flipped it open and held it inches from Torres's face. Inside, beneath the laminated ID card that showed her photo and a false name, was a heavily folded piece of parchment, her formal discharge orders, bearing the signatures of 3 separate heads of intelligence and the seal of an organization that officially ceased to exist a decade prior. Beside the parchment, tucked neatly into the plastic sleeve, was a small kindergarten drawing, a crayon sketch of a smiling stick figure standing next to a large dog labeled Mommy and Eliza. She held the image for a moment, letting the juxtaposition of the lethal operative and the loving mother settle into Torres's rapidly deteriorating sanity. I retired, Colonel. I chose quiet. I chose baked goods and PTA meetings and learning to drive the speed limit. I chose to be boring. Her voice was laced with a chilling disappointment. You took that choice away. You brought the war to my house. She snapped the wallet shut. Now, she stated, her voice returning to that crisp operational tone, you will open that door, unarmed, and you will ensure that my daughter is uninjured. If you hesitate, if you look at me wrong, or if I detect a single elevation in your heart rate that suggests a last, desperate act of defiance, I will use this blade to demonstrate the exact difference between fear and professional respect. Torres nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face, the fear of the ghost operative far surpassing the fear of his impending fate. He scrambled to his feet, guided by Santos's controlled, silent movements. He crossed the room, his knees knocking, and fumbled with the heavy electronic lock on the steel door. As the lock clicked open and Torres stepped back, collapsing against the wall, a small, 7-year-old girl with bright, terrified eyes peeked out. Eliza. Santos kept her gaze locked on Torres, never taking her eyes off the potential threat, but her body language shifted microscopically. The tension eased, the weapon slightly lowered. Eliza, Santos said, her voice instantly softening, stripped of the technique and the cold edge, becoming purely maternal. It's okay, baby. Mommy is here. Eliza didn't run. She walked slowly, hesitantly, looking past her mother at the carnage in the room, the bodies, the spilled blood, the overturned table. She saw the silence in the dead eyes of the men who had terrified her. She looked up at her mother, seeing not Mrs. Smith but the chilling authority that had claimed the space. Santos simply smiled, a genuine, tired, relieved smile. She knelt down, dropping the ceramic shard to the floor with a tiny, ringing sound that was deafening in the silence. She wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling her into a tight, protective embrace. Let's go home, Bug. She stood up, still holding Eliza, shielding her from the scene. She cast one final, cold look at Colonel Torres, who was now weeping hysterically, utterly broken. He understood that she wasn't going to kill him immediately. She was going to leave him alive, stripped of his men and his power, to be discovered by the inevitable law enforcement, thereby ensuring that his capture would cause maximum structural damage to his network. His death would have been a mercy. His life now was a calculated tool of destruction. Santos turned and walked toward the exit, her steps quiet, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. She didn't look back at the bodies of the 4 men she had neutralized in 5 seconds flat. She didn't need to. The cleanup was done. The threat was mitigated. The mother walked out into the sunlight, leaving the operative behind in the silent, dark warehouse of consequences. The mission criteria were simple. Retrieve the asset, eliminate resistance, conceal operational presence. For Sergeant Sue Santos, the distinction between a mission brief and a mother's promise had ceased to exist the moment they touched her child. If you believe respect is earned by blood and not by rank, type respect in the comments.